Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm coming to you with the PoetryTube Newbie Tag, which was created by the two noble gentlemen over at Stripped Coverlet. I was not directly tagged in this, but it was suggested in the comments section on another of their videos, Adrian's Litmus. Whoa! Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm coming to you with the PoetryTube Newbie Tag. And I was not directly tagged in it, but it was suggested in the comments section of another of their videos, Adrian's Litmus goal setting video, that I might like to do this tag, so here I am. I'm very excited to have been kind of tagged in something poetry related for the first time, because I do like poetry, but you know, we'll see how this goes. While we're on the subject of goals, I am just very quickly going to share with you one of my goals for this channel. I did make a kind of a goal setting video, but it was a long ramble, so it's been consigned to the bin of probably never to post. So my main goal for this channel is to produce 52 videos in 2019, so one video per week on average. This will not be consistent, and I have no plans to create any kind of schedule because I know that I'm just not competent enough for that. But I think 52 videos should be feasible given that I have managed around 30 since I started this channel in July. My plan is that I will do at least 12 tags and at least 12 reviews, definitely. In theory. And I'm really toying with the idea of also doing at least 12 poetry videos, with this being number one of them. So let me know what you think of that after watching this video and realising just how little I know about poetry. I would say that that is my deepest, darkest secret as somebody who comes onto BookTube and starts doing candlelit poetry readings. I know nothing about what I'm talking about. Shh, don't tell anyone. I'm doing quite a good job of pretending. So most of my experience of poetry comes from secondary school when we had to read an anthology for GCSE. I do still have that anthology, but it is back in Brighton with my parents. Then in college I did a course called the International Baccalaureate and I did higher level English in that. And my exam for English had an unseen poetry component, which was just my favourite thing. So basically you were given a random poem and an hour or whatever the time length was, and you had to write an entire analysis of that poem in the space of an hour. It was really fun and like a good challenge to have. Then I did a teeny tiny bit of Spanish poetry in my first year of uni before I dropped out of my arts degree like the poetry pro that I am. And between then and 2018 I really read no poetry whatsoever. And then along came Shakespeare and Mark from Wordswords Everywhere, who encouraged me to read some of the sonnets. Well, he didn't encourage me personally, he encouraged anyone who was participating in Shakespeare, but you know. And then Victober with some Victorian poets, and I even squeezed some haiku into non-fiction November, so suddenly and bizarrely I became a reader of poetry. Well, that was an introduction and a half. This is a tag video, not a life story, so let's try to get down to the question, shall we? Question number one, do you read and write poetry, or do you just read it? My initial answer to this is that I just read it. I have absolutely no pretensions to become any kind of a poet. But as we're doing the whole life story kind of thing, I thought it might be entertaining to tell you a little bit about my poetry writing history as well, because yes, I too had an emo poetry writing phase. I was also one of the select few members of my secondary school poetry club. Thank you, Mr. Offord, for giving up your lunch break for the four of us. And all of my greatest works, as I believed them then, were transcribed into this notebook. Most of them make me wince deeply to read them now, but my true poetic strength, I firmly believe, has always been in writing comic verse. So I thought you might be amused to hear this limerick that was composed on the occasion of my brother's 16th birthday, which I undoubtedly plagiarised from somewhere. This was in 2008. He was a gurgling baby with red cheeks. Our Alfie has come on in great leaps. He chortled, he chewed, and oh, how he grew. All of that just in the last week. On a more serious note, I find that reading poetry can directly inspire me to try to write poetry in a way that reading fiction generally doesn't do so. So after reading the sonnets, I wrote a series of sonnets at work on my breaks on night shifts, which I now can't find, sadly. But I really like the challenge of bending that traditional romantic form to the modern hospital environment. Then, after reading the Haiku from Narrow Road to the Deep North by Matsuo Basho, I wrote my own little, not exactly haiku, but mini poems while I was waiting for the bus in the mornings because I felt inspired by this idea of capturing a very tiny moment in verse. I wrote 6 and they all really worked in the sense that they strongly remind me of the insignificant instance that they were written to capture. So yeah, that's my history of poetry writing in a nutshell, and I already told you my history of poetry reading, so we're good. Question number 2, who is your favourite poet? Okay, I pretty much answered this one in December, and I'm going to stick with that response for now. Insofar as I am able to name a favourite poet, which I am loath to do, the same with naming any kind of favourite ever, it would have to be John Donne, who was an English metaphysical poet and politician who lived from 1572 to 1631. If you watched Adrian's original version of this tag, yes, this is the same John Donne who wrote The Flea, a poem in which love is compared to a flea bite. He chose that as his favourite poem to read aloud. I think one of the reasons I do love John Donne so much is that he's one of the few poets I ever had the opportunity to study in a classroom full of people who really cared about literature, and I still have my notes to this day. We were guided through that by just a completely fantastic English teacher, Sean, and I think that having the chance to delve deeper into some of his work gave me a better understanding of him than I have of other poets. I didn't like him very much at the time. I believe that I was quite angry with him as a man, much as I have been at times with Shakespeare, but in the years since, some of his poems have really stuck with me. Question number 3. What question would you ask your favourite poet? It is very amusing to me to imagine a situation in which I, as a young female atheist, would meet up for coffee, say, with John Donne, who was frankly quite misogynistic, ex-Roman Catholic Church of England cleric, and be able to have a rational conversation. I don't think he would consider me worthy of talking to as a young woman unless he was making suggestive comments about my underwear, or saying that my truthfulness was about as likely as him catching a falling star. You know, I'm seriously beginning to rethink my choice of favourite poet. So I might take him up on that, but I might also ask him about his use of innuendo. So there was one particularly amusing incident in the English lessons I was just talking about, when we were talking about Donne's religious poems, and I have read through all the notes that I kept on Donne, and I cannot find which poem line we were talking about. But it was about Donne sort of trying to negotiate with Christ, and as our English teacher put it, the way that it is phrased, he is either saying to his Lord, you know, take me seriously, or he's saying, take me seriously. So I would ask, did you really mean to put sex jokes in every single poem? Question number 4 is just favourite poem. Still talking about John Donne, but that's okay because Adrian basically only talked about some dude called Bukowski I've honestly never heard of. This may be the one poem that John Donne wrote that does not have a sex joke in it that I have yet found, and if there is one, please don't ruin it for me. The poem is Sonnet 10, Death Be Not Proud, and I will not read it out for you here because I am hoping that later in this month I will film a reading and discussion of it. That said, I wouldn't wait in suspense for that because how often do I follow through on my promises to make certain videos? As an alternative, for many years I would have said Sonnet 116 by Shakespeare, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment, but I think I've just grown out of loving that poem as much as I did. It's almost like now that I am sort of in a grown-up, loving, happy, fulfilled relationship, I don't need a poem to paint that mythical picture of love for me. Question number 5 is, what is your favourite poem to read aloud? I could stick with John Donne here and talk about the poem I shared with you in December, A Nocturnall upon St. Lucy's Day, because I have forced my family to listen to that one a few times of a December evening, but instead I have tried very hard to think of something else. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome rough sound grave. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch, beware the jubjub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought, so rested he by the tumtum tree, and stood awhile in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. Oh, frabjous day, callooh, callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogoves, and the moon rafts outgrave. That is, of course, Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. I know it's nonsense, but it's also just really fun. The only other poem that comes to mind is in Spanish, and it's not one that I would like to read aloud because I don't have a great Spanish accent, but there are some lines in it that just sound truly lovely, and they kind of get stuck in my head from time to time. The poem is Yo persigo una forma by Rubén Darío, I pursued a form, and my favourite line is Y no hallo sino la palabra que huye. Y no hallo sino la palabra que huye. And I find naught but the word that flees. And I feel like that line in itself should just be the title of a book or a poetry collection, or I should really have used it for my channel name or something because I just love it. Question number 6. Who is on your Mount Rushmore of poetry? Okay, so Mount Rushmore is some weird American thing that you guys seem to think that everybody else on the planet is in full awareness and understanding of. But I guess what you are asking for here is basically a list of like 4 great behemoths of poetry. People who played some kind of foundational role in the poetry of your culture as opposed to personal favourite poets. For this, I'm quite limited to English language poetry. If I wasn't, I would include Homer because he's certainly very influential, but I think that it's not fair to have Homer up there when I haven't really read any other epics to compare him to, like, say, Gilgamesh. So the first of these, unquestionably, is of course Shakespeare. There is nobody else who has had such a massive impact on our language and literature, in my opinion. Then, I think I would go a little bit further back in time and include the author of Beowulf, because if we were talking about foundations, then this is one of the oldest works of poetry that we still have that was written in this country. Stretching forward in time for the next one, I'm going to pick a poet that I have not read, and that is John Milton for his work Paradise Lost, because again, this is a work that has proved very culturally important. It was very widely read, and even to this day we can see authors such as Philip Pullman drawing on it for inspiration. I'm really torn on number 4. I thought about Tennyson, but I think that's only because I've been reading his work this week. So instead I'm going to go for William Wordsworth, purely because he truly dedicated his life with questionable success to creating the Prelude and trying to begin to create a new form of poetry that would be more modern, more accessible, more socially conscious. When you're looking at a poem like, say, Michael, where he's addressing some of the social changes that he's seeing in the Lake District, I think that's quite important for poetry in terms of it having that side to it. Like, it seems he really thought about what he was doing and the poetic form and where he was taking it, and a lot of his work remains very popular and well recognised today. I know that Roz will be very disappointed in this list because it's not very gender balanced, but honestly, I just don't know any female poets that have had such an influence until we move more into modern poetry, which I don't know that much about, and it also didn't seem to me to be the kind of the point of this question. What I will say is we don't know who wrote Beowulf, so there is no reason to assume that it was a man. Question number 7 is, what is your favourite poetry collection? So I used to have a huge poetry anthology as a child. I guess it has since been passed on to some of my younger cousins or something like that, and I think it was called the Puffin 20th Century Collection of Children's Verse. Every page was illustrated in a way that linked it with the poem, and there was a full range of child-friendly poetry in there, from the humorous to the heartbreaking. I do wish I still had that book because I had a lot of favourite poems in it, and I can remember holding it in my bed when it was like an A4 size book, so it was bigger than my arms could really manage, and just going through it again and again. So that would be my original favourite. That's probably the only poetry collection that I have ever read the whole or the majority of, because I just don't tend to pick up a book of poems and sit down and read it all. I also have at home a miniature book which is a combined collection of the poems of Shelley and Keats that used to belong to my grandmother, and when I was in the previously discussed emo poetry phase, I had this idea that all respectable mopey teenagers should be familiar with the Romantic poets. So I read a lot from that book, and I would count it as another favourite, not for the poetry in it, but for the associations that it has. Although I do quite like Shelley. My favourite poetry collections that I own here in Yorkshire are my Victorian anthology that I read a lot from during Victober because it is very informative in terms of the notes as well as containing a lot of great works. And also this very pretty volume of Tennyson from 1913 because the pages are just so smooth and so shiny. And obviously the poetry is quite good too. Question number 8, rhyming. Talk about it? Yes, no, not anymore. Yes, yes, definitely yes. Honestly, I hardly believe it's a poem if it doesn't rhyme, and I kind of set an extra barrier in my head for it to like prove itself as a poem, which really just proves how much of a Philistine I am when it comes to modern poetry, so we are going to move swiftly along from this one. Question number 9 is, barring free verse, what is your favourite poetic form? This would have to be the sonnet. Basically, I love a poem that stands up proudly and says, it is a poem. So having a very strong and recognisable form is key to that for me, and I find the sonnet one of the most distinctive forms there are. If a poet restricted to that form can still make something really powerful, really original, that conveys their message in a unique way, then that is something that I can really get behind and respect. I think most of the poems that I've mentioned so far are sonnets, which just reinforces how narrow my poetic world is. So there was Death Be Not Proud, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds Admit Impediment, Io Persigo una forma is also a kind of sonnet, and in my video on Sonnet 26, When in Disgrace with Fortune and Men's Eyes, I also mentioned a modern sonnet that I love called Waking with Russell by, don't know who it's by, put it in the description. I think a part of this is that I don't have the patience or the comprehension for long form poetry, so a poetic form that is inherently very limited really suits me. Because of this, I haven't read much modern poetry, and I fully admit to probably being quite biased against it, because most of it's not in the sonnet form. That is something that I will maybe start to address in 2019, we shall see. Apologies for the camera reposition, I've just found out I've got 1 minute left of memory on my phone. We were on humour in poetry, question 10, so my answer to that is yeah, why not? Not every poem all the time, of course, but I love an amusing poem because you can really use the poetic style to add weight to the punchline and to build expectation and so on. I think things like rhyme and alliteration are such useful tools in humour that we should definitely be using that. Phone, you are just the biggest piss take. Like, I had a memory card in and it wasn't using the memory card. So I can do this again, but slightly more relaxed. So what elements do you think contribute to the best poetry? Is this where we just list poetic techniques? Because really, I think what makes a good poem is when a poet can take all of those techniques, you know, like alliteration and enjambment and personification and rhythm and tone, and use them in a way that is unobtrusive but simultaneously contributes to the meaning of the poem. I like a poem that you read once and you think, well, that's a good poem. You read it again and you think, hang on, there's something more going on there. And you read it again and again and again, and you begin to use those techniques and the little clues that they've left you in the language and in the themes to develop your own interpretation and your own meaning to that poem. For that, I think there needs to be some kind of theme to the poem that has potential breadth to it, and some language that can be looked at in different ways, and also some really effective images. It needs to be that every word is right, that it never feels like one was just thrown in because it rhymed or fit the meter, but rather that the words and the meter and the meaning all marry together in harmony, and that takes true talent. I don't mean by this that a poem has to be universally applicable. I really love some poems that are tied very closely to a specific historical moment, such as Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, or Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est Pro Patrio Mori. But I think even though they have a very specific grounding, these poems, they also call upon more general themes, in those cases questions of what it means to be a hero in the chaos of war, and through those more general themes, that is how a poet can introduce something that makes a great poem. So that was all of the questions. So what do you think? Did I do a good job of pretending to know about poetry, or should I resign from PoetryTube in shame? Let me know in the comments, and let me know also your thoughts on any of the poets that I've mentioned and your personal answers to any of these questions if you would like to. In terms of tagging, I would do another round of newbie tagging, but it's a little hard because I don't necessarily know who is into poetry in that, and I don't want to be putting something on somebody that's too much pressure. So instead, I'm going to tag some people who definitely do poetry on BookTube. I don't know if they will have been tagged yet because I'm going to film this and then it'll probably be posted a good couple of days later, so they might already have been tagged in the meantime and done it and posted it, and then I'll look like a bit of an idiot, but that's cool, that's totally normal. So my list is Chrissy from the Return Cart, who's a very new booktuber, and she was talking the other day about focusing a little bit on some poetry in the coming year. I'm also going to tag Joseph Francis Burton, of course, because I loved what he did with the Badass Poetry 101 tag. I found that very interesting. I think Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse has been tagged in this, and I think probably Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading has also been tagged. I know that Mark from Words Everywhere was already tagged by Strip Cover Lit, but I'm just going to lend some weight behind that. And I believe that Lukash from Totally Pretentious has already done this. And just anyone, if you want to talk about poetry on BookTube, or PoetryTube as we now have, if you want to bring more poetry into your discussions and into this corner of the internet, just go ahead and let me know in the comments that you're going to do it. I always feel like it's a bit of a cop-out just saying, oh, anyone who wants to do this tag can do this tag, because it just kind of makes the tag lose momentum. But I think with this tag, we don't necessarily know who each other are that are talking about poetry, if that makes any sense. So it's one that people are more likely to need to kind of invite themselves to. So as usual, thank you very much for watching, happy reading, and I will speak to you soon.